Okay, so hello everyone, welcome everyone to Scientia Science Writing Internship Cohort 4 2025. Today we have an incredible guest, someone who has been mentoring Scientia for quite a while, Dr. Alex Dainis. Uh, Dr. Alex Dainis you guys could search over on Google. She is a phenomenal science communicator, uh, being watched by millions of people all over the internet through her videos, through her writings, collaborated with a lot of platforms like PBS Digital Studios, Boston Museum of Science, and also more importantly, she runs her own SciComm company called Helicus Media, and she has been doing a phenomenal work for like last 10 years. Our academic backgrounds is from Stanford University. She has a PhD in genetics. One of Scientia's very first and interesting interviews we have for Dr. Alex on our website. And recently, she was honored with Eric and Wendy Schmidt Award in Excellence in Science Communication. So, welcome, Dr. Alex. It's always amazing, and we are all excited to hear you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being asked back each year to talk to these cohorts. And I was saying beforehand, I would encourage you all, please afterwards, connect with me on LinkedIn. I love being able to follow up afterwards and see what people in the cohort are doing and what you all are writing and what's going on with the cohort. So please connect with me online. I've really appreciated being able to speak with you all every year. And so I'm excited to meet you all this year. So the title of my talk is likely communicating, or the language of science communication in uncertain times. And I want to acknowledge right up front that we are in very uncertain times. The first time that I gave this talk actually was last year to this cohort. I've been giving it in different manners afterwards, but you all were the first to hear this talk last year. And I've changed it since then because I feel like the world of science communication has absolutely changed in the past year since I last talked with this cohort. And I think we're more worried than ever about public understanding, public perception, and science funding. So again, I'm excited to talk with you all. And I also want to just thank you all for being interested in science communication at this point in time. The world of being a science communicator is changing. I think it is getting harder, to be quite honest. And so I appreciate you all wanting to join this field and wanting to try and get good science out to other people. It is so incredibly important. So the inspiration for this talk and for this idea of thinking about uncertainty in science actually came from a YouTube comment that I got, or a TikTok comment that I got about 4 years ago. Early on in the COVID pandemic, I was making a lot of videos about vaccines because my PhD research was in RNA. And so this felt like something that I was an expert in and I could talk well about. And I was talking at one point in time about the vaccines and how they work. And I got this comment on one of my TikToks, and I think they deleted it afterwards. So I've never been able to go back and find it. But it has stuck with me because this person said, "You're using words like likely and maybe. You don't know what you're talking about. When I was in school, science had answers." And this stuck with me so much because this is not, I think we all know, how science works. Science is a process of questioning. Science is about how we know, not what we know. But when it's taught, it is taught as just, this is true, this is true, this is true, this is true. It's taught as a series of facts. And so I think it leaves people to feel unsettled, and it leaves people to think that scientists don't have confidence when we use the words of uncertainty that we know are so important to communicating science. I cannot tell you with 100% certainty that, this drug is going to cure your disease, right? I have to say that we have perhaps an 80% certainty that it's likely, that it's possible. Those words keep us honest. And those words also, when we're talking about data, connote the fact that there's more to learn, that if we learn more things, we can update our understanding. But the public doesn't perceive them that way. And so I think it is important that we think about how we're communicating science, especially in this age of misinformation, when people who spread mis and disinformation are often doing it with those words of certainty. They are saying 100% this vaccine is going to hurt you, and people hear that confidence and they respond to it. So this all came from an idea that I want to talk about that framing of uncertainty. I do also just want to talk a little bit about broadly before I dive in, the kinds of things, the kinds of work that I do, because I think they're the kinds of work that are open to you as science communicators. So I've been, as was mentioned, I've been talking about science online for about 13 years at this point in all different facets. At this point now, for the past 7 years, I've been working full-time as a science communicator, and I do a whole host of things. So I do workshops like this, sometimes virtually, sometimes I'll go in person to departments and talk to scientists about how they can communicate their science. I do write and host YouTube videos, so for places like the American Chemical Society and PBS Digital Studios, but I do a lot of behind the scenes work too. I do a lot of producing where I'm not on camera at all, but I'm helping connect scientists to filmmakers. I'm helping craft the stories that are going to tell science outwards. And I also do work with corporate clients. There are a lot of organizations out there who are working on scientific technologies and scientific processes that want to talk to the world about what they're doing. And sometimes this is marketing and sometimes it's not. It's always some part of marketing, but sometimes it's also educational. So the picture under corporate clients here was a corporation that I worked with that was making a mint-based herbicide to try and get away from things like glyphosate. And it was, mint oil, essentially, that if you spray it on plants, will kill the plants. And they had me do a podcast with them to talk with their scientists a bit about the science of their work, but also to talk about what their career paths have been and what they do as a scientist at this company. So sometimes it's also sort of education and career building as well. But I think the main thing about my career and the thing that I think serves all science communicators really well is the ability to ask good questions. I think every scientific story comes back to a question. Maybe that's a question that you have, maybe it's a question that your audience has, but I think figuring out what is or isn't a good, compelling question for a story, who can help you answer that question? How do you know that you fully answered it? When do you know that there just isn't an answer to that question, right? That science doesn't know those things. How do you find that endpoint? I think science communication is all about asking good questions. And I have to imagine, because you're all in this cohort, and I know how awesome these cohorts are, that you're all excited about asking questions. So I would encourage you to do that at the end of this presentation. I'd love to talk about these things. So I'm going to talk about 3 main things today in my talk. I want to talk a bit about why it is so important to communicate science. Again, you're all part of this cohort, so I think you're on board with the fact that this is important, but I want to highlight a few specific examples. I want to talk a bit about why we use uncertain language in science and why it's so important. And then I want to talk about how we can adapt that to other audiences. How can we talk with the public about scientific uncertainty and do that in a way that they feel comfortable with? So, of course, I think we're all aware that there are rising societal and ethical issues around science that I think people are becoming more aware of in the news, but maybe don't feel like they have the vocabulary to participate in those conversations. And I think it's important for everybody to be talking about science and scientific decisions. So I, as who's mentioned, I am a scientist by training. I am a geneticist. So a lot of my examples come from the world of genetics. And I think that we're seeing things like human genome editing and GMOs and CRISPR popping up more in the news. And I want people to understand what those words mean. But I think too, we're all very aware of the fact that climate change is rising. And I think it's been talked about for a long time as its impacts on the planet. But I think we also need to be talking to the public about its impacts on agriculture and human health. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters because we love the planet, but it doesn't really matter to us what happens to the rocks of the planet, right? What matters to us is how it impacts humans, how we can understand climate change better and get everyone to understand how it's going to affect us so that we can mitigate its effects on human life and quality of life. Then again, also over the past 5 years, vaccines and global disease are big things along with wellness and health that people are curious about and are looking for information about. And we want to make sure they have good information that they can find. And finally, new technology, AI, these are things that people have questions about. How is it being used? Where is it being used? How should we use it or how shouldn't we use it? These are all things that I think we as science communicators can help the public understand and help them participate in these conversations. For me, that's always one of my end goals of my mission is I don't just want to give people information. At the end, I want them to be a part of the conversation. So that's really important to me. And we do know that public stories about science can have really big impacts on public actions. So about 15 years ago now, this example is starting to get old, Angelina Jolie wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the fact that she had been diagnosed, or she had undergone genetic testing and had found that she had a variant of the BRCA gene that put her at increased risk for breast cancer. So she decided to undergo an elective double mastectomy to try and reduce her chance of getting that cancer. And this story was seen really, really widely by a lot of people, and it talked about genetic testing for breast cancer. That story then had a direct impact on women going out and asking for these tests from their doctors. So on the x-axis here, we have time. On the y-axis, we have number of BRCA tests per 100,000 women that women were asking for from their doctors. And you can see this spike in 2013. That is the year that this story came out. There was a measurable difference in people's actions of going to their doctors and asking for these tests after that story came out. So we know that talking about science can impact people's actions. This was a slightly more recent example of this, that there was another genetic story in the news. Chris Hemsworth, who's a popular actor, went out and talked about the fact that he had found that he had a variant that put him at increased risk for Alzheimer's. So he was going to take a step back from some of his acting career to sort of focus on his family. And I went to Google Trends right after this came out, and I searched for people who were looking for both the ApoE4 gene and genetic testing, and found that there was a spike in searches for both of those things right when this story came out. So people saw this story and then they immediately went to Google to try and find out more. And I want to make sure that when they do that, there's good information for them to find. Now, this is a study that focuses specifically on the US. I'll bring up some world data in a minute, but I'm based in the US, so this is where a lot of the data that I see is coming from. We know that confidence in scientists is dropping over time. So this breaks it down a little bit by political leaning, but just overall in this left graph here, you can see that sort of overall confidence, the people who had a fair amount of confidence in scientists to do the right thing, essentially in the best interest of the public, went down and started to decrease from 2020 down to 2023. And we have a slight increase in 2024, which is excellent. But I think we want that number to go back up to pre-pandemic levels. We want people to have confidence in science again. I think one of the good things about the study, though, this is a study that asks about a lot of things, is that while only 73 or 76% of people having a fair amount of confidence in scientists doesn't sound great, we want 90, 100% of people to have that kind of confidence. We do actually have a lot more confidence, or people had more confidence in scientists than they did in business people, than they did in politicians, than they did in the military. So there is a lot of goodwill that scientists still have that we can help to raise up. This was a study looking more broadly across the world at 68 countries, asking people about how they felt about scientists, where their trust was in scientists, how they felt about scientists' role in society. The first 4 bars here are looking a lot about policymaking and progress, but the thing I want to highlight is this bar down here at the bottom, that 54% of people felt that scientists should communicate about science with the general public. They strongly agreed with that. 29% sort of, medium agreed with that, right? More than even scientists getting involved in policymaking, people felt that scientists should be communicating with about science to the general public. And this is from, this data was collected in about 2024. This paper came out in 2025. So this is recent data. People want to hear about science from scientists. And we also know that scientific interest and knowledge can impact funding attitudes. This is something that we are feeling acutely here in the United States right now. This is a slide that I have presented for the past 5-6 years. I've talked about this all the time. It's not a beautiful graph, but what it is saying is that people with more scientific knowledge and more scientific interest think that we should be spending more money on science. And again, I've been presenting this graph for a while. I've been saying we need to be worried about this. And this is what we are seeing, imminently here in the United States, is that science funding is being slashed, absolutely cut by about 50%, because the current administration here does not have a lot of faith and trust in science, does not like the scientific establishment. So money is being cut. And again, we were just talking right before this started that means money for science is drying up, but also money for science communication, for outreach efforts. I mean, we are in a crunch right here. But it's not just us in the United States. I went to some data across the world. And so this data is a little outdated now. This was from 2022. This is the most recent data I could find. But I did look at Pakistan's research and development spending over time. And it too has decreased since a high around 2016, 2017. So scientific funding is going down. And we know that that's correlated with scientific interest and knowledge. So if we as science communicators can increase that knowledge, we can try and convince the public and policymakers and people in power to put more money into research and development spending. It's a hard ask. It is hard. Not any single one of us is going to make this change, but together I think that we can. So this is why I think these things are so important. The other thing that unfortunately the US and Pakistan have in common at the moment is that we are two of the top 6 countries that the World Economic Forum thinks are at a high threat for disinformation and misinformation online. So this was a study taken in 2013. They looked at mis and disinformation online, and they talked with about 1,000 business people and leaders and politicians across the world, asking where they felt that, which countries they felt were at most risk for receiving this misinformation and disinformation. India was in first place, but Pakistan, I believe, came in 4th, and the US came in 6th. So we are both in some of the top spheres right now for misinformation and disinformation just running rampant on the internet and on this, communities that we are in. So I think this is a place where, as science communicators, we can try and stand up a little bit and push back this wave and try and keep mis and disinformation in line a little bit. So with all that, I think you're already on board with communicating science, but I think it's more pressing than ever. So now I want to talk a little bit about that uncertainty. So we know that communicating uncertainty is critical in science. And this is the example that I give, that I can tell you that it is unlikely that you will be struck by lightning on your way out of this talk. Many of you might be at home. It's unlikely that you're going to be struck by lightning while you're listening to my talk. But I cannot tell you that for 100% certainty. I cannot see the future. I can't predict that there's not going to be a freak storm that arises, right? And then strikes your house kind of thing. It is unlikely, but by using that word unlikely, I am at least leaving myself open to the possibility of new information, of new scenarios. That is the most honest and accurate way that I can communicate. But I think we all know that when I mean unlikely, I mean a teeny tiny percentage. But people don't always hear it that way. And we'll talk about some stats on that in a minute. But for science, it acknowledges that science is a process and not a set of facts. It leaves room for more questions and hypotheses and knowledge. And it acknowledges that we very rarely prove things in science. That was one of the first things that I remember learning when I, went from high school to my undergraduate career, that we didn't prove things in science, right? It is incredibly rare that we have the ability to do that, because we know that there might be room for more data to come in. And I really love this quote from a book called Communicating Uncertainty, a Challenge for Science Communication, that says, without uncertainty, science legitimacy and reputation would be at stake. It is so important that we include these words of uncertainty. However, we also know that uncertain language is decreasing in scientific publications. So this was a fascinating paper that came out a few years ago that looked at over 2,600 research articles published between 1997 and 2021 in the journal Science. So they were all the same journal, so there's no journal-to-journal variation here. But they looked for search terms such as could, appear to, approximately, these words of uncertainty, and they saw that they decreased over time. So they went from 115 instances per 10,000 words in 1997 down to 67. So it was about half. They, about halved in how much people use these. And they can't prove why, but they have hypotheses about why this is. And part of it is that the science sort of publishing industry right now has moved to really publishing these big splashy papers. So people don't feel like they have the room for these hedging words. They really need to be able to sell their, language and their results to these papers. So the words of uncertainty are decreasing. So we can feel that, right? We can feel this pressure to use fewer and fewer of these words because we have to sell our stories to editors. We have to sell our stories to the public. But they're still so important. However, as I mentioned before, when we use words like likely or maybe, people don't always hear the same thing. I might think that when I say likely, I mean 95%, but someone else might hear the word likely and think 60%. So this was a really fun study done online, and this is it's at probabilitysurvey.com. You can still go to this now and fill out the survey. I am going to give away some of the results here, so it'll be a little skewed, but they asked people for something like, 50 or 60 words like this, words of uncertainty. What percentage do you think it means? When I say the word likely, what do you think? And then they graphed out people's responses. And so for the word likely, people in general, sort of that median was about 70%. If you say the word likely, the median that people hear is about 70%. Now, some people think it means more, some people think it means less, but about 70%. And you can look at all of these different words and what people think they are. So never, people think about 0%. I think that makes sense. Almost always, people are really way over skewed. But there's a bunch in here that like maybe is around 50%. I think that makes sense. But like serious possibility is really spread out. Some people think that's a really high number. Some people think it's low. So I just think this is fascinating when, as science communicators, we are using language and we are choosing language. I think this can be a really helpful resource. If you want to get across, that something's about 80%, you can look at this resource and say, oh, okay, usually is going to get that across. But I think also when we use these words, it's nice to double check, I think possibly might mean 40%, but what do other people think? So this, I think, is a fun resource when you are writing to help choose words that are going to best convey the message to the greatest amount of people. However, there's also intra and inter field variability here. So this is a graph. There's not really numbers here. It's mostly a timeline. But on the x-axis is how the public perceives different scientific fields being certain. So on the left, people think that psychology is one of the least certain fields. And on the right, people think that forensic science is one of the most certain fields. This does not reflect the actual certainty of these fields. This is just how people feel about them. And I feel particularly taken aback by this as a geneticist, that genetics scores so low, climate scores so low, evolution scores so low on how people think, how certain people think it is. And I really think it is because of how these stories are talked about in the media. There is so much debate in the media, not necessarily in the scientific field, but in the media around evolution. There is so much debate around the climate that I think people think it's much more uncertain. Forensics, on the other hand, I think has a great marketing department, not intentionally, but shows like CSI, forensic science shows, true crime, all of these things make people feel like forensics is a very certain science, when in all honesty, many of the forensic techniques that have been used for years and years, things like blood spatter analysis, bite mark analysis, are being shown to be very uncertain, but people see them on media and think that they're so certain. So I think this is something that we can try and change. However, one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about this study is that while people have these feelings about broad fields, if you present specific studies with specific data, you can overcome these perceptions. So if I show someone a specific genetic story, I can overcome their pre-existing perception of how certain it is. So using certain data is very helpful. Okay, so with those things, how can we adapt our science communication to communicate this uncertainty, but also reflect what's actually happening in science? So again, the first thing that I want to tell you is you probably already have some experience in this. By talking about science, as scientists, we are asked to be science communicators all the time, right? We give talks, we give posters, we write papers. If you have any kind of science background, you already have an ability to try and communicate this uncertainty. So take what you've got, and we're going to just add some more skills to it to sort of help communicate that outwards. The first thing that I always think about in any science communication language is to consider your age. So this is your audience, your goal, and your environment. So this is going to change the true language that you use when you were talking, and it's also going to change how you shape your stories. So for audience, you want to think about who you're talking to. And I have a lot of clients who say that they want to talk to the general public. And that's too broad, right? That's really too broad of an audience because it's so hard to know what they're bringing to that. So think about your audience. Are you talking to an audience that's specifically looking for science? Are you talking to a young audience, an old audience, an audience who has a background, who doesn't have a background? Maybe they have some sort of, interest, right? I've done work on sports science pieces before. And so I was working with Red Bull. And so I knew that their audience was excited about science, excited about sports, but maybe didn't have a physics background. So those were things I was going to need to explain to them, but I probably didn't need to explain to them, the specific moves that this high diver was doing, right? So think about what your audience knows and doesn't know. You also want to think about your goal. And I think this is something you can be really, really specific about. When I think about communicating science, I really think about what is the one thing I want people to walk away with. And maybe that's a piece of knowledge. Maybe it is a question. Maybe too, you might be writing something or writing a paper to find a collaborator. Maybe you're writing something with the idea that you want people to come work with you. You want people to join a conversation. But I try and think really hard about what is that final impact I want this piece to have. And then, of course, you want to think about the environment. You're going to build a different story if you're doing a written piece or if you're doing a video or if you're doing a podcast. That final environment where the story is going to live is going to impact how you gather your sources and gather your data. So this is an example I love to give of this. This is a paper that came out a couple years ago about flexible tool set transport in Gotham's cockatoos, right? This was about birds using tools. Now, the audience here was other scientists. So they imagined that other scientists would be reading this research, so they put it in the environment of a scientific journal. We know that that has really set standards for how you write things, what you're doing, and they could assume that the scientists were coming to this with prior knowledge, maybe about birds, about tool use, about neuroscience. So they assumed a lot of things. And their goal here was just to communicate their findings. So this is a perfect format for that. But this paper was also picked up by the news. So this is an article written about that same story in the New York Times, but they had a different audience. This was maybe a science-interested public, a different goal. They didn't necessarily need to communicate every specific data point. They just wanted to get across the kinds of things these scientists were interested in. And the environment was a newspaper. So they wrote the story very differently. The first line here is, cockatoos contain contradictions. They behave like little gremlins. Imagine a toddler with pliers in their head, right? It's a very different presentation of the same story than this one, which starts off with, tool innovations are a prime repository for the evolution of technology across species, right? Very different presentation of the same story. But it didn't end here. This story was also presented on TikTok, where now they used a video because we're in a video environment. They didn't use any verbal, sort of overlay, but they just showed a video of this cockatoo using this tool. They presented the story in a different way to capture people's interest. Also, there was a tweet from the New York Times. Their goal here was to get people to click. So again, they just used that great line, imagine a toddler with pliers in their head, right? So they're getting the same story across in different environments to different audiences with different goals. So I would always encourage you to think about those three things up front. Now, the other thing now we're talking about uncertainty is that people sometimes worry, and there's a lot of debate in the field over this, about whether or not you should communicate using numbers. And I'm going to encourage you that you should, because as we saw before that with things like likely and maybe, it's not always clear if you mean 70%, 65%, 90%. I think as much as possible, you should try and do that. And this was a study done that looked at people's trust, and there was only a minor effect on trust negatively when communicating science with numbers. So I think it can add that certainty, and it really helps people get a grasp on what you're talking about. The other thing that I think is really important here, and this is guidance from the European Food Safety Authority, which has to communicate about uncertainty in food and safety all the time. They have a great resource called Guidance on Communication of Uncertainty in Scientific Assessments, where they really walk through the types of communication you can do about uncertainty based on the information level of your audience. So I think this is a great resource because they break it down here. You can see at entry level, informed level, or technical level. Who are you talking to, right? Like, are you talking to the broad public about a food safety outbreak? Or are you talking to people who are going to be working to fight that food safety outbreak, right? So what is the information level? And then what can you do? So for example, if it's just entry level, if you're talking to people who are just, looking to see whether or not their lettuce is contaminated or whatever it is, just say that uncertainties exist using wording in the scientific output. So the example here is the experts identified limitations in the data on exposure and toxic effects. So just tell people there is uncertainty, we're working on it. Versus on a technical level, you should try and identify which sources of uncertainty have the most influence on the conclusions, except by qualitative assistance. So you're giving people more detail. But overall, their broad thing is that you want to describe the sources of uncertainty and then address the uncertainty. And this, I think, is so important. You want to talk about why we are uncertain. If there is something where you're like, hey, our model can only capture X% of meteorological data, and that's why we're uncertain. We're not uncertain because we're bad at our jobs, right? We're uncertain because the model can only handle so much data, or we're uncertain because we've only explored 80% of the genome so far. Talking about why we're uncertain is really important. And I gave this talk to a faculty group late last year. And one of the professors came up to me afterwards and said that she is often called in as an expert witness on jury trials to talk about chemistry. And she said that she has had to really deal with this because in science, we use words like uncertainty and error. And when the jury hears error, they don't think, oh, standard error of your calculations. They think you made a mistake. So she has to do a really good job of talking to the jury first about, hey, when I say the word error, I don't mean I messed up. I'm talking about the amount of error we have in our calculations just based on math. So describe why there are sources of uncertainty, tell people that up front, and then address the uncertainty. That's one way to get this across that's very effective. Again, same thing. Acknowledging uncertainty is really important. And then tell people what the audience can do, right? I think I'm coming back to food safety because there's been a E. coli lettuce outbreak. But if the thing is, there is lettuce out there that might be contaminated with E. coli, tell the audience, maybe don't buy bagged lettuce right now. Maybe you should go to buying heads of lettuce and cutting it up yourself because that's safer. Giving people something to do with that uncertainty, giving them an action they can take to deal with it can be very empowering and can increase how receptive they are to that knowledge. This is also a great handbook, the Uncertainty Handbook. It comes from the climate communication space. So climate communicators have had to do a lot of communicating about uncertainty over the past decade or two. And they really say to focus on what we know. So focus on the facts and the things that we do know to be true. Emphasize places where there are consensus, and then use words and graphics. So that consensus part, I think climate communicators have learned really strongly, and I think really in a difficult way, that the media, often tries to be fair and balanced, which is good, and tries to portray both sides of a discussion. However, in something like climate communication, where there is an overwhelming majority of scientists who think that the climate is changing and a small minority of scientists who think that it isn't, presenting them as equal sides can actually do a disservice to science because it is not emphasizing the consensus within the scientific community. So I want you to think about that when you're thinking about who you present. Yes, you want to be fair and balanced, but you also want to think about making sure that you are actually portraying the consensus in a field rather than just finding somebody on both sides to try and be fair. The other thing here I think is so important is using words and graphics. So this is a study that looked at communicating uncertainty and using either just verbal language or verbal language plus graphics to get people to understand data. So when you say to someone, your chances of developing colon cancer in your lifetime are between 5 and 13%, that's really hard for people to conceptualize. Without seeing a graph, it's actually very hard for people to know, is 5 to 13%, it sounds low, but how low is it? What am I doing? People were much more receptive to when that same information was presented with a graphic. So here they have taken your chances of developing colon cancer in your lifetime. They have put it on a graphic. There's nice colors. The colors actually in the end didn't make a huge difference, but they show on a timeline where this is, and people feel a lot more comfortable, and they also feel a lot less stressed by this. So you are presenting the same information, one just with words and one with words and graphics, and people are much more receptive and feel much more calm when they get the one that has the graphics. So as much as possible, display your uncertainty with images wherever possible. I think it is so helpful. The other thing, again, because we talked briefly about misinformation and disinformation, that I just want to touch on, because I think it is so important right now, is that as much as we can pre-bunk and debunk misinformation as science communicators, the more we can cut off the spread of misinformation. So this is just a little, graphic from the WHO of a piece of misinformation over on the left being spread to 3 people, and at each dot it spread to another 3 people. But there are different things that these people did to stop that spread. So things like not sending rumors that you don't have citations for, double checking your facts, getting news from trusted sources, asking, how do you know that's true? We want the audience to be doing this, but I think this is something that we can model as science communicators. I think in our writing and in our publications, more and more, we need to be talking about how we know these things. We need to be talking about, here's how I did a literature search. Here's what I asked as a science communicator. Wait, how do you know that? And then how did I find a good answer to that? How did I find an answer that I was like, yeah, that scientist knows what they're talking about? How do we read papers with a skeptical eye so that we know we can trust what we're communicating? I think we need to be modeling these behaviors in our science communication so that our audience can understand what they need to do. I think also there has been a lot of debate about whether it is better to pre-bunk, so to get ahead of misinformation and tell people, hey, you might hear this rumor and it's not true, or debunk misinformation. Hey, you've heard this thing and it's not true. And there is debate, so much debate in the field about which is better and which is more effective. And I think really the reason why there is this debate is because the answer is we need both. We need science communicators to be getting out in front of people and inoculating them with good information before they see the bad, and then also debunking it after that information is out there. So this, I thought, was a really fascinating paper. This was a model of debunking or pre-bunking misinformation. And so the idea was that they started a community of people who were susceptible. They had a 10% chance of being susceptible to a piece of misinformation. And then they either set the parameters that some of the people had been pre-bunked or they were only pre-bunking and debunking. And so on the left, the blue line here is people who are susceptible to that misinformation. The orange line is people who are disinformed. So you can see that as one goes down, the other comes up. And then the green line is people who have been, quote unquote, vaccinated against this misinformation by debunking. And same thing over on the right. And on the left, they are just debunking. So you can see there's a big period of time where a lot of people are disinformed, and it takes a while to bring them back down with that debunking. And over on the right, they've pre-bunked. So they've vaccinated people against this misinformation with good information. And you can see that that amount of disinformed people is much lower. So we need both things. We need both pre-bunking and debunking to try and stop the spread of misinformation, which again is a big problem for both of our communities at this point. The other thing that I think is really important in doing this is that questions can help change minds and help people feel much more confident with this kind of uncertain information. So this, I thought, was a really fascinating study where they took people and they gave them opposing points of view and had them have a discussion around something. And some people, they just stated facts, and other people were encouraged to ask questions. And the discussions where both sides were able to ask questions, people were more receptive to information from a counterpoint to their argument. So if you are really trying to engage an audience and get them to come around to your side, get them to receive your information, I think it is so important to ask questions, not just your audience asking you, but you also asking them in your pieces, in dialogues. That's the way that we get people to become more comfortable and more receptive with information, is to engage in dialogues as much as possible. So I want to leave some room for time for questions. So I talked through a bunch of stuff today, but before I wrap up and take questions, I want to leave you with what I think are some of the most important resources that I can give to you today. The first is my absolute favorite book on science communication right now. It is called Strategic Science Communication by John Beasley and Anthony Dudo. And they take that idea of audience, goal, and environment and break it down even further into goals, objectives, and tactics. So the goals here are behaviors that you want people to take. So maybe this is voting in a way, maybe this is making health decisions for themselves. They want you to think really deeply, and I think this is so important, about the behavior you want someone to take at the end of your piece of science communication. To get there, they want you to think about objectives. So these are beliefs that you need to instill in those people, or feelings or frames, so that they take those actions, right? So for example, you want people to believe that their health is important so that they go and take an action for their health, right? So you need those beliefs, and then they break it down in the tactics so that you can instill those beliefs so that people take those behaviors. So it is a incredible breakdown. I recommend this book to everyone. I think it is really fantastic. The other book I recommend is How Minds Change by David McRaney. So this is a really deep dive into thinking about changing people's minds on divisive topics. And he talks a lot about deep canvassing, which was a technique that was pioneered maybe 20 years ago around really divisive voting measures here in the US, where people would go out and go door to door and talk to people about their experiences to be able to change minds. So they talked about their experiences and they asked questions about topics that could be emotional, topics that could be pretty charged. And they found that by engaging with those personal dialogues, sharing stories, and asking questions, you could change minds. And I think about these kinds of things all the time in science communication. I think this is so important. So I love both of these books for that. The other thing on a slightly more practical standpoint that I want to give out is a new resource to me, but that I have been following for a while. It's called The Science Freelancer, and I'll send around these slides so that you can click on these links kind of thing. But you can also, I think, just Google The Science Freelancer. This is a newsletter put together by someone named Amaya Paleja, and what they do is they group together science communication jobs every single week, and these are worldwide. I actually believe that they might be based in India based on some of the jobs that they post and the time that they post. But they pull together all of these different jobs and resources, and they range. Some of them are full-time jobs, but a lot of them are remote. Some of them are writing gigs. Some of them are pitch calls for scientific publications. So this, I think, is an incredible resource. And they, do this just totally based on donations, but truly, truly incredible as you're looking for places to put your writing, opportunities, jobs out in science communication. I have no affiliation with this, but I cannot recommend it highly enough. I think it is so useful. And the final thing I want to leave you with is the Open Notebook. So this is an incredible resource online that you might be familiar with. They pull together so many different awesome articles about science communication and best practices. And they put out this resource recently that I think is very important on misinformation and disinformation. So these are their top tips. There's a whole, printable 2-page PDF. I think it's really great. It's a great resource to refer back to about how you can fight mis and disinformation, which I think is just so intrinsically linked to the language of uncertainty. So I can't recommend that highly enough either. There's also Sciline. So this is really helpful if you're looking for specific experts. I subscribe to their newsletter. And so about once a week, every 2 weeks, if there's a big story in the news, they'll say, hey, we have a bank of quotes from researchers about this topic, or we have opportunities for you to ask questions to experts in this thing that's in the news. So I think Sciline is also really, really helpful as you're reporting on sort of current news stories to get connections to active scientists who are willing and have signed up to answer your questions, which I think is really helpful. So all of those, I think, are huge resources. And finally, I want to reiterate again, I love talking to this cohort every year. You all have great questions, so I'm excited to talk with you now. But also, please find me online, reach out to me if there's anything I can do to help. I think you guys are doing incredible work. And please find me on LinkedIn and connect. I love following up on the stories that you all write. I love seeing what these cohorts do, with the incredible internship that you have. So please find me on LinkedIn. I think some of you already have, but I just love watching the work that you do. And so that would bring me joy. But with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you have and keep chatting for a little bit, because I know that that was a whirlwind of information. So I'd love to just sort of talk and see what else I can do to be helpful. Any questions?
Okay, so you can raise your hand and ask questions. Now we are into the Q&A. Yes, yes, Ali, please.
Hello, Doctor. Thank you so much for this session. I just wanted to ask about how you were using all of those certain numbers like 5%, 13% of uncertainty. How exactly do we calculate those percentages?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically that comes from the science that you are reporting on. So for example, again, all of my examples come from genetics, but one of the things that we think about a lot with genome editing, which is in the news quite often right now, is off-target effects. So places where you want to edit, portion A of the genome, but maybe you accidentally edit portion B. We know, and we can calculate from doing genetic studies, how often that off-target effect happens. And it depends on the study, it depends on the exact gene that you're targeting, but typically it'll be something like, I'm making up a number here, but 2% of the time there will be an off-target effect. So I can say in my piece, most of the time we target the place we want to, but that is not really helpful to people, right? It's better for them to hear most of the time, around 98% of the time, we target the spot we want to, right? And that gives people something, a number to grasp onto. So I would say most of the time that can come from the specific scientific piece that you're reporting on. There will be those numbers in that scientific article. But I think also too, there are things that you can do if you don't have those numbers to try and give people a better understanding. So for example, the scientific, here's one, most scientists in the climate change space feel that climate change is real, right? There's likely not a specific article that goes out and tallies up what that number is, right? Like they have not surveyed every single climate scientist to know exactly how every one of them feels. However, you can do things like look at number of publications about it. You can look at surveys that have been done on, the number of scientists in a specific department kind of thing. So I think as much as possible, if you can find a reference number from a survey that's been done, if you can find a reference number from the specific article, you won't always be able to find it, but I think that's our best support for those kinds of things, is when we can rely, same as we would for any other reporting, on the data. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, it was. One other thing, which websites or survey platforms would you recommend to get these statistics from?
Yeah, so what I will typically do is I will go to Google Scholar and then type in, they let you search by reviews. And so I feel like review articles are often a really great place for this. So I'll go to Google Scholar, I'll select for reviews, and then I'll type in whatever question I have. So it might be, scientific consensus on X, or it might be, looking at the most recent data on, I have a cup of coffee next to me, so, is coffee better or worse for your health kind of thing. And then review articles, I feel like, are a really great place. And I love that Google Scholar just lets you search for just reviews. So that's honestly my biggest, it's not super fancy, but that's typically where I find most of these things.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, the other one actually, I will, now that I've just thought about that, there are two other places that I love for these kinds of data, actually, both of which I used in this presentation. So one is a little US centric. So that's the Pew Research Center. So they do really incredible public surveys on all kinds of things about, public trust in science, but also, a whole host of things like media consumption, all kinds of things. So the Pew Research Center is a great resource. But the other one that I used in here is Our World in Data. So it is a website that pulls together tons of data sets from around the world, from big organizations, from the World Economic Forum, from the UN. They pull together all these data sources, and then they put them in a way that you can create graphs right in their website. So that's how I made the graph of Pakistan's, research funding over time. Is I went to Our World in Data. I looked for global R&D spending on science and technology. I sorted by country, and then I just asked it to make me a line graph. So Our World in Data is a huge, huge resource when I'm trying to figure out just like, how do different places feel about things? How has spending changed? How has CO2 output changed? How much are people fishing out of things? They have immigration data. They have a ton of data that I think is really helpful for framing stories. So that is my other piece, is Our World in Data is a very useful resource for that.
Well, that's
All right, thank you so
quite
much.
helping. Yeah, Yasir, please.
Hello, Dr. Alex.
Hello.
First of all, thank you so much for the amazing session. My question is that if as a science communicator, you are addressing the general public, how would you know the background knowledge of your audience? Because as you mentioned, it become too wide audience, especially regarding the topics like gene editing, CRISPR gene editing. How would you communicate them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think about that very differently depending on the type of story I'm working on. And I'll give two examples. One of my big clients is the Boston Museum of Science. They are typically talking to a very general audience that does not have a science background. This is someone who might just be scrolling through on Facebook. It's not someone that we can assume has any sort of scientific knowledge. So I really, really just talk about the one main point I want to get across in that story. And I talk about it in language that, someone who has gone through maybe no scientific background can have, right? I will explain everything, right? If I'm talking about DNA, I remind people that it is the information that stores, or the molecule that stores information in your cells. I talk about what a gene is. I really explain every piece of it because I don't anticipate that they come in with any other understanding. On the other hand, when I work with the American Chemical Society, our audience totally comes in with a scientific background. Maybe not of the specific topic, but we know from doing a lot of surveys, because I do a lot of work there. They collaborate with PBS Digital Studios. They do great audience surveys. We know that the people coming to us often do have a science background. We know that they know what a gene is. We know that they know those things. So now I can go a level deeper. I can say, okay, here's the main story, but now we're going to dig into the details. We're going to go deeper. So I can tell the same story, but with less of that upfront explanation because we know they already come with it. So I think it's all about the platform that you're using. And I also think it's important as scientists, I think sometimes we are worried about over-explaining ourselves, especially when we're giving a talk to other scientists. We are so worried about looking dumb and saying like, oh, if I explain what a gene is, they're going to think that's because I didn't know. And that's not true, right? As an audience member, we never feel that way. So I think that I always try and err on the side of explaining more than I think they need so that they can come on that journey with me, because I don't want people to hit a word that they don't know and go, oh, I don't know that, I can't read the rest of this, right? It turns people off. So I think if you don't know the level of your audience, lean towards over explaining, because the people who know will just skim through that and they're not turned off, but you're going to keep more people with you. But on the other hand, if you are on a platform, people who are coming to the magazine probably are already a little science interested, right? They might not have a science background, but they're already tuned in. They want to know about science. They want to go a little level deeper. So you can go a little deeper with them. So I think thinking about that platform is important.
Thank you. That was much helpful.
Okay, so we can also take one or two more questions, hopefully. You can also text in the question if you would like. In the
I know
meantime,
sometimes it can be scary to say it out loud.
Yes. Okay, I have a very different question. I'm very actually since you are very much into data and you have been doing this for quite a while, uh, how do you think we are into the video production area? Everything is all about reels and what we have been from into what we could say art entertainment. Now we are into the post distraction time. So that as a lot of people talk about, as you might have read the article about the culture of. So the thing what I would like to ask that video has immense potential. Everyone wants to watch videos and reels, and also as we have been doing work, as you have been doing, we are trying to create quality content that is what we could say that is helpful actually.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, but how do you think has the readership is it affected? But at the same time, as we could see, he lives in the time of op-eds, New York Times, WAPO, and Net Geo. Nature is going on and everywhere. So how do you think distinct between two, and how do you think the video production has affected the readership?
Yeah, I I think about this a lot because when I post a video, it actually gives me a readout of how many hours people have watched that video. So not one person, but like how many days of human time have been spent on watching that video. And that to me feels like a huge burden, right? Like I had a video that, it just showed me, it got like 800,000 views. And so it was 31 days of time that people had spent reading that. And I was like, was this video worthy of a month of collective human time, right? Like that feels like a huge burden. And so that to me, on one hand, is very scary in a way. And so I think when I am making a video, is this worth people's time? Is this worth collective human time? Am I going to do things better? And then I do try and compare that, right, to the other stuff that's out there, to all these op-eds, to things that are more for entertainment. And then I see a done video online and I'm like, okay, if they're going to spend time on something, I hope they spend it on science rather than me. But I do think that, you mentioned distraction too. Like we are making stuff now, written language or videos that people are watching on their phone. We are fighting against a text message that just came in from their mom, about a calendar invite that's coming in, about something that's happening here. We are fighting to keep people in that good content. And I think it's getting harder. I think it's absolutely getting harder. And I think it is pushing people towards making things that are more sensational. I think it is pushing people towards making things. I think this is why misinformation runs rampant, because if you don't care about accuracy, you can say anything to get eyeballs on it. So I think that we need to maintain absolutely our accuracy, our commitment to making sure that what we put out is high quality. But I do think, and I kind of hate saying this, but I do think we need to make sure that we are thinking about emotion, that we are thinking about the ways that we pull people into a story. And it is unfortunate that the things that really get shared online, and there have been studies done about this, the things that get people to share are often things that are scary, are often things that elicit negative emotions. So sadness, fear, right? If I tell you, like, even if it's asking a question, hey, is this vaccine going to hurt us, right? That's something you're more likely to share than somebody saying, no, like that's not as good of a story. So I think we need to lean into storytelling, and we need to do it accurately and well. We need to do it honestly. But I think stories are how humans share. It is how we connect. And so we need to think really deeply about how we communicate that good information as a story that's going to pull people in. And again, I think, there was a story that came out about a month ago that I made a video about a baby who had undergone gene editing for the first time and saved his life, kind of thing. And it worked really well because people care about kids, right? They care about kids getting healthy. And so I think using those kinds of stories to pull people in, again, positively and accurately, but then delivering scientific information in them is one way to try and fight it. But it's a hard tool. And I see another question that just came in. What writing tools do you recommend for new writers to improve their writing? I will tell you, this is going to be an unsatisfying answer. It's to write more. It's to write and write and write and write and write. I think for any art form, be it making videos, be it taking pictures, be it writing, the way to get better at it is to write and write and write and write and do it and do it and do it. And I think, you know, I saw a great talk by Jad Abumrad, who was one of the guys who did Radio Lab a while ago, who talked about the fact that, like, you got to make a lot of bad stuff before you start making good stuff. And you have to persist, you know, and not necessarily the things you're writing are bad, right? But like whenever I try something new, right? I think about this all the time. If I'm going to try a new video format, if I'm going to try, you know, a new type of communication, I just have to know that that first piece I make is not going to be the greatest thing I could potentially make in it, right? But then I'll get better, and then I'll get better, and then I'll get better. And I think about this in life too. And a very silly example, but I've started crocheting, right? This is a new skill to me. The first things I made are so ugly. They're so terrible, but I'm getting better, right? And I'm just keeping through it. And I didn't stop when I made that first ugly blanket. I kept going. So it's the same thing. It is just, it's not a tool other than just using that skill over and over.
Well, I think another question is for you.
Oh, from Worcester. Oh my gosh. I don't, that's so funny. A whole bunch of my family's from Worcester. Hello. So I don't know that they have a volunteer program for writing. I know they have a in-person volunteer program, but connect with me on LinkedIn and I will look into that because I'm connected to their media team. So please connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message, and I will follow up with you on that. But I do know they have an in-person, but commuting from Worcester into Boston is kind of tough, but amazing. Hello.
Amazing. Another one is for you.
Yes, an unexpected challenge you face when transitioning. Oh my gosh, so many unexpected challenges. I think honestly, one of the biggest ones was an identity one, that I had been a scientist for so long. And when people ask me, what do you do? I'd be like, I'm a geneticist. Oh, I work in science. That then transitioning to saying like, well, I was a scientist, but now I just talk about science and now I do it. That actually was really hard to be able to say, no, I still have authority in the things that I'm talking about, and I can still make them with this scientific background. So it was very unexpected, but I really struggled with continuing to have that authoritative voice for a while. And I had to overcome that and say, no, like that is my educational background. I can stand on that and I can still move forward. The other thing, this is the other thing that I will throw out, was that because I went from being a graduate student to being a freelancer, knowing what appropriate pay was also very hard, because as a student, you work all the time for no money. And then I started to become a freelancer and worked all the time for no money. And so I think it's sort of the same thing. It's learning to value yourself as a science communicator, that this is an important field. People need you and your expertise. And a lot of people will ask you just to work for exposure. Don't do that. I mean, a little bit at the beginning, but value yourself and your expertise. That was an unexpected transition for me.
Amazing. I think that's all it. I think we have quite wonderful questions, and we have been very much deeply dived into the answers. And I mean, this webinar has been such a, what we could say, a lot of facts and data. We backed up a lot of things through that. And more importantly, the answers and your experience have been wonderful for the interns. And I hope you guys can connect with her. She's one of the most helpful scientists and communicators I've met, and which is true and inspiring as well. So thank you, Dr. Alex, for your time and your energy and inspiring us all again. And we would like to reconnect.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I always love talking with you all. And so I hope to connect with you all soon. Have a lovely rest of your evening.